broken, the outsiders, the outcasts. In this book, we'll study many of the most loved passages in Luke, passages in which this emphasis on God's concern for the outsiders is front and center, passages that remind us that Jesus, like Garth Brooks, had friends in low places. As a young man reading this gospel, I felt in its words that Jesus would befriend me. I hope you feel that as you study this gospel too. A plan for reading this book. My hope is that you will read the Gospel of Luke alongside this book. I've put together a 40-day daily reading plan for Luke's Gospel. Each daily section is less than 15 minutes. If you are listening to this book for Lent, plan to complete one chapter of it each week, along with the daily Gospel readings for that week. Each chapter will correspond to one of the 6 weeks of Lent, with the postscript to be read the week after Easter. A copy of this reading plan can be found at adamhamilton.com/Luke. If you are reading or listening to this book with a group of friends, there are short videos I've recorded to go along with each chapter. There will be several thousand churches that will read and study Luke together this Lent, with pastors preaching from Luke, and children, youth, and adult study groups studying this book and Luke's Gospel together. You can find resources for children, youth, and adults at adamhamilton.com/Luke. Authorship, dating, and major themes. Scholarly commentaries on the various books of the Bible typically begin with their own introduction, describing what can be known about the book's authorship, date of composition, and major themes. I'll give you a very brief summary of the consensus of mainline scholarship. One thing to note as you study these questions about any New Testament book is that conservative scholars tend to defend the traditional authorship of the New Testament's books and date the books as early as possible. Secular scholars tend to question the traditional authorship claims of the New Testament books and usually make the case for much later dates. Most mainstream evangelical and mainline scholars land somewhere between the two, supporting traditional authorship in many cases, but questioning it in others. Likewise, they'll tend to support early dating in some cases, but with few exceptions, their dating is later than conservative dates and earlier than secular dates. When it comes to Luke, conservative scholars accept the traditional claims that Luke, the beloved physician, composed the book sometime as early as the mid-50s to the early 60s AD. Secular scholars note that the Gospels were all written anonymously, and that Luke's name does not appear in the Gospel. The names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were added later, based upon church tradition. They often date Luke to near the end of the 1st century, or the first quarter of the 2nd century. Finally, evangelical mainstream and mainline scholars recognize the Gospels are anonymous, with many accepting that Luke, Paul's sometime traveling companion, may have composed the Gospel, while some are less certain. The mainstream evangelical and mainline consensus is that the Gospel of Luke was written between AD 75 and 90. Let's spend a few more minutes speaking about authorship, and then I'll give you a summary of where we're going in the chapters ahead. Authorship. As noted previously, unlike nearly all the letters of the New Testament, none of the New Testament Gospels identify their authors. They are anonymous. But early in church history, they became associated with their familiar names: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew and John were apostles, and Mark was believed to have known Jesus. He was a cousin of Barnabas and an early traveling companion of Paul. While Luke's name appears nowhere in the text of the Gospel or in Acts, he is mentioned by name in Colossians chapter 4, verse 14, where Paul writes of Luke, the dearly loved physician, in a way that makes clear that he was with Paul while in prison as he wrote Colossians. Many point to the interesting medical details and terminology.